everyone, and thank you for downloading this week's episode. As ever, any likes and shares will be greatly appreciated. Today's episode is the second part of the nuclear debate, and in this episode I will be speaking with pro-nuclear advocate Mark Nelson, who is the founder and managing director of Radiant Energy Group, a nuclear advisory and consulting firm based in Chicago. Mark holds a BS in aeromechanical engineering from Oklahoma State University and has qualifications in nuclear engineering from Cambridge University, and has been a consultant to the clean energy industry and environmental organisations around the world. Mark is an extremely passionate and highly technical person that is very much concerned with the granular aspects of a question in order to try to formulate an answer on the most technical level he can, whilst also being humorous and accommodating. Despite interviewing Romana first last week, I didn't want to just keep saying, well, Romana said this or Romana said that, as I've tried to approach the interview with a clean slate so as to gauge Mark's opinions on the same topics that I did with Romana, which I just thought was the fairest way of doing it. As stated in the first episode, I've tried my best to keep my own feelings out of the episodes, and obviously it is a stretch to say that either show will have a definitive answer to the debate around atomic energy. However, my genuine hope is that they are a valuable addition to the discourse. Now on with the show. Mark, a warm welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on, Adam.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for your time. So Mark, you've dedicated your working life to understanding, researching and working within all things nuclear. But where does this passion come from, and when did you first see or read about the immense power of atomic energy?
I've always been passionate. It's just not always been a productive thing that I've put my passion towards. When I was studying piano, I was passionate about that. Photography, right. Passionate about that. An athlete, I was passionate. So I needed something that had a capacity to keep me fascinated for a really long time. And for me, it was pretty late, I'd say. I was studying engineering and Russian at a university here in the US. And I had a scholarship to go study at Cambridge University in Britain, so long as I could figure out something to study that was sort of like engineering, right?
Yeah.
And I couldn't think of what. My family's business, several generations back, has been involved in oil and gas. And although it was sort of interesting, I was pretty obsessed with sustainability and environmentalism, and it wasn't appealing to me. I thought, if I do this and I'm doing it well, I might come into conflict with other bigger goals like protecting the environment or making a clean environment for my children. So I thought to be really good at it might be limiting. So while I was searching for what to do with my studies and maybe my life, I saw a YouTube video about how early we were in developing nuclear reactors, how there's been ideas and concepts that we barely even scratched the surface of nuclear power. That was the first time I properly thought about nuclear power, despite living in America that has the world's biggest nuclear fleet, despite working as an intern at Los Alamos National Laboratory during one of my summers at uni. Still, none of that broke through my attention barrier, I suppose, as a concept. Nuclear energy as opposed to nuclear weapons or nuclear fusion. What happened then is about 2 or 3 minutes into watching that video back in winter 2012, I realized something. I was like seeing a giant tic-tac-toe board and seeing all the squares start to line up. Environmental sustainability, tick.
Yeah.
Economic stability, tick. Interesting technology, tick. Interesting politics, tick. Interesting business, tick. And as this tic-tac-toe board got bigger and bigger while still having a line all the way through it, I got more and more excited, and I just watched more videos. I read as much as I could find. I went to Cambridge for nuclear engineering, and I haven't shut up about it since.
Yeah, amazing. So we've got quite different experiences. So for me, I was born in sort of the back end of the Cold War. So even though I was very, very little when it kind of ended, I was still aware of the potential for nuclear war. I was dragged at 5 years old to a CND, which is like an anti-nuclear protest group. I'm not sure if it's worldwide, but it's certainly in the UK, when I was about 5 years old. And I have an 11-year-old son who obviously didn't grow up in the Cold War. And I think he saw an Indiana Jones film where they did the whole fake
The
town.
nuclear weapons test in the desert,
Yes,
right?
yes. And he sort of saw that nuclear weapon and he was like, "What's this?" And I was kind of telling him about it. And he was watching YouTube videos about old nuclear bombs going off, the testing. And it absolutely blew his mind just how powerful bombs can actually be. So we've all got three completely different experiences there, but that was really interesting. Now, just for those in our audience, Matt, that don't know who you are, tell us a little bit about your qualifications in this arena and why you've been invited onto the show to talk about everything sort of nuclear.
I'm from Oklahoma, and that's where I am now, a land of wind turbines and oil and gas wells and cattle, but no nuclear plants. I grew up here, went to university here to study mechanical and aerospace engineering. Was very interested in fighter jets and astronautics, and thought I would try to go to space or build rockets. I've mentioned why I was interested, and I needed a subject that was big enough to have all the stories in one spot, all the difficulties in one spot, and nuclear has as many stories as you could ever want, as much emotion as you could ever want, and as many difficulties as you could ever want to work on. So for me, I wanted something hard and fascinating, switched to nuclear engineering for graduate studies. Got my master's in nuclear engineering at Cambridge University. Stayed on for the start of a PhD because I had funding and there were interesting problems that I was looking into. Left before finishing that and ended up in an unenviable position for a young engineer, unemployed, and in a sector, in a place in America in 2015 and 16 where nuclear energy was dying. They weren't hiring people at the plant. They were attempting to lay people off at the plant. This was a time in 2015 and 16 before the climate movement had turned to become much more pro-nuclear. You had the climate movement against nuclear and neutral or in favor of natural gas. You had natural gas that was extremely cheap in America. That was helping put the nuclear plants out of business. You had all sorts of schemes for building more renewable energies that were nuclear exclusive. They excluded nuclear, but included wind and solar. You had incredible declines in the price of wind and solar equipment, along with increasing efficiencies of both the industry and the equipment itself, right? So it was a perfect storm, all happening in the years following a triple meltdown in Japan that would have apparently put the end to nuclear energy ambitions around the world. So it was a terrible time to be a idealistic young nuclear engineer. I couldn't get a response back from the local nuclear companies. So what did I do? Well, first of all, I was quite underemployed, and I just kept reading and studying problems that were interesting to me. One of the things that came out of this, Adam, is that I was calculating electricity emissions. So the emissions from electricity hour by hour, not just like on average over the year. I wanted to see what it looked hour by hour when you combine the wind, the solar, the nuclear, the coal, the hydro, the natural gas. I made a chart, shared it with some people I'd met online. One of them leaked it to Twitter. It started going viral on Twitter. I started getting emails in my inbox to me, unemployed person with no affiliation who dropped out of a PhD, asking me, how did you do these calculations? Where do you work? Who'd you make this for? Can you come work for us? I ended up working out in the Bay Area of California starting autumn of 2016, in this new moment when there was pro-nuclear environmentalism starting to come out of the same place in the world that the anti-nuclear environmentalism had originally emerged from. And that's Berkeley, California. So between 2016 and 2020, I was in Berkeley and I was living in San Francisco, working in Berkeley, and we had one major problem. All around planet Earth, nuclear plants were closing and being replaced by either fossil fuel or degrowth that didn't save any emissions. So you had a combination of people getting angry at the economic outcomes locally, while also having higher emissions due to the lack of nuclear. And what was especially troubling to me is almost everywhere that nuclear plants were closing, I, as an engineer, knew that those nuclear plants were good for longer and longer service lives. So it wasn't just we were losing old nuclear plants and they were gone for a bit. The panic, the fear for us in those days, working at the environmental nonprofit, was that we were losing nuclear plants early in their lifetimes, 40 years before retirement, and that if only a little bit of turnaround in public sentiment came, or even a little bit of strict pollution controls on fossil fuels, suddenly the nuclear plants would be the most valuable, cheapest, and effective ways to base a zero carbon economy on. And we were losing them. There are places that people think of as nuclear champions that were planning to strip out some or all of their nuclear reactors. Let me give you one example. I know this is a long origin story, but France. France is famous for having a lot of nuclear. They had turned almost totally against nuclear. The national nuclear company had turned almost totally against nuclear. The president of France, Macron, had run and been elected on a platform of destroying a lot of the nuclear fleet. There were laws in place to seriously degrade or almost completely destroy the effectiveness of the nuclear fleet. And they did get far along that path. They actually started tearing apart working reactors that would have been fine for another 30, 40 years. And doing all of this while preaching to the world about climate change and the need to stop emitting carbon. So you can imagine the weirdness of being a young environmentalist going into nuclear for environmental reasons. Watching people rip out nuclear plants while claiming we just all need to tighten our belts and sacrifice. But they were getting rid of exactly the technology that would have allowed us to decarbonize with little sacrifice at all, depending on your interpretation of the modeling and where we're going with industry and the climate. So from about 2020 onwards, I left the environmental nonprofit and I had my own consultancy that I set up. We're still a relatively small practice, but we take on tricky issues that range between engineering, which is my background, all the way to public policy and we do a lot of polling to figure out what it is about nuclear that people do and don't like, what they do and don't expect from their governments or from nuclear companies, and also what their concern about the environment does to their concern for nuclear energy.
One thing that is pretty clear is the time that we've got, we're not going to be able to cover every aspect of the arguments between nuclear or non-nuclear pathways going forward. And in all the time I've been in the environment movement, which has been over a decade now, it's probably the most polarizing issue in the environment movement in regards to which pathway we should go down to. So what I'm going to try and do, Mark, is I'm going to try and break it down into what I believe are the three major issues, on both sides, okay? So what I've broken it down into is, and see if you agree, the first one is around the issue of nuclear waste. The second one...
I do agree.
The second one is the connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And the
Excellent
third
topic to cover. Yep.
Yeah, and the third one is the time and resources it would take to make the world nuclear. And those that are sort of anti-nuclear, for want of a better phrase, say that it'll take too long. It'll take too many resources, and with the time that we've got, tipping points will kick in well before we see the benefits of nuclear. So are you happy with those three areas for us to chat about tonight?
Those topics, I'm not just saying this to flatter you, Adam, because you brought me on the show. Those are three, if you had asked me, pick the strongest arguments about nuclear, not just that they're out there and that they're strong because they're loud, but actual issues that we have to cover. Two of those are the strongest actual arguments against nuclear, and I'm so glad you brought it up because there's a lot of people in nuclear that feel afraid to talk about them. And then finally, with the waste problem, it's not that it's, in my opinion, a very strong physical argument against nuclear, but I'm telling you, it is the number one argument that people who are both for and against nuclear are all converging on as the main remaining thing informing their position or slowing them down from embracing nuclear further. So you couldn't have chosen three better topics. And there are other topics people talk about, like the meltdowns or the fuel. So just before we jump in on the meltdowns, Chernobyl nuclear plant kept operating and actually made more electricity after the accident than it did before. So I'm not saying it was okay to have a nuclear plant blow up. I'm just saying that there's this image of like a death zone for 1,000 years or whatever. And not only is it before the war, it was a very popular tourist attraction, but it kept operating as a nuclear plant for 14 years on the same site. So there's the meltdowns for us. On the fuel, there appears to be enough uranium everywhere. If you want to demonstrate that there's enough uranium, just for yourself, buy some uranium stocks and then watch your money go down. So
Yeah.
if you want to see just how much uranium is out there and how inexpensive it is for the reactors for the world, you just see that you only need a tiny bit of it to fuel all the world's reactors, and it means it's a struggle even to fund the mines. You need, I think at the moment, we've got about 7 or 8 mines that provide the vast majority of the globe's uranium. Most of those don't even dig anymore. They're just little water wells that go down, put in a solution that picks up uranium, and then they suck it out the other side. There's almost no carbon or remaining environmental footprint for those modern uranium mines. So there we go. That frees us up for your 3 big things, which is the waste, the weapons, and the resources.
So in no particular order, but let's start with the waste, okay? So I watched an amazing documentary that you may have seen yourself a good 10 years ago now. It was about the waste facility in Finland, a place called Onkala. Have you seen that documentary, and do you know what I'm talking about?
No, but I've been to Onkala.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah. So for the audience, this is where Finland have decided to dig a cave of some kind, like underground, deep underground. And it's a whole documentary about some of the philosophical questions as well as the practical questions about where to put nuclear waste, which the best will in the world will last hundreds of thousands of years and will be toxic for that amount of years. So let's talk about the waste, Matt. What's your argument? Can you just lay on the table what you think the argument is for anti-nuclear, and then why you think that's not necessarily a good argument, or you can mitigate some of those concerns?
Sure. Thanks, Adam. So here's the first thing that I would say. The amount of waste. If you were to get all of your life's energy from nuclear power, not just what you get today from electricity, but if we were using nuclear for primary energy and using the heat to make artificial hydrocarbons, and we were electrifying heat and electrifying transit and using all that on the grid too. If we were doing everything that you need from nuclear energy, how much waste would you personally be responsible for? I'm talking about the spicy stuff, the real high level, long-term radiotoxic waste. Well, it'd be about the volume of this coffee mug here, right? So about this much waste per person. Now, you can look around and see how much space you require to live, or how much space you might require if you've looked up waste, how much solid waste you generate. We can handle that. That's not much. And if you put all of societies in one spot, you would find that you would not take much space at all. Depending on how you spaced out everyone's waste, what you'd find is a few football pitches. Now, if you put more reasonable assumptions and spaced it out a bit further and tried to keep it a little spread out, now you're into maybe a couple dozen football pitches to provide the waste storage for Europe for all of the energy you're getting for your life. And that's if we don't recycle the waste, and it's if we don't switch to much more efficient reactors that use it all up, which maybe we will, maybe we won't, but I'm just discussing the technology we've built and managed to run today. So there's the waste issue as a scale. The reason why it's so little is because you're getting 1 million times more energy out of each interaction, out of each atom of uranium, than you would get out of burning a molecule of hydrocarbon, if that makes sense. So it's a 1 million to 1 ratio. That's because you're using the nuclear forces as opposed to the weak electromagnetic forces of the molecule of the hydrocarbon. Okay, some nerd stuff right there. Hopefully you'll be forbearing. So there's not much waste, and it's because you get so much out. Then the next thing is, well, okay, maybe it's not so much, but what if it's really radioactive? Here's the thing. There's radioactivity where you shouldn't let it inside your body, or you shouldn't sleep with it under your pillow. And then there's radioactivity where you shouldn't be too close to it, and you have to have lots of shielding, right? I'm going to stay a little bit away from pure scientific, like breaking down alpha, beta, gamma rays. I'm just going to say that the tricky to manage part of blocking this out is easily done with a bit of lead, and then not or steel or concrete, and just not being too close. The next part is the amount of heat you could build up if you're trapping something away from the environment. You have an issue of heat. Well, the hot part is something that reduces really, really fast. And when I say hot, I don't mean just radioactivity. I mean it's actually hot. Like if you buried a can of this, it would melt all the snow in a northern driveway, right? I'm not advocating, I'm just saying the heat that these things put off, that decays pretty rapidly. Here's nuclear waste story. You put nuclear fuel in a reactor, and before you put it in, you can get close to it, you can touch it, you can hold it, it's not gonna hurt you. Once it's in the reactor for 4 or 5 years, then it's way too dangerous to be close to. You absolutely do not want to be close. It's very radioactive when it comes out because it's got particles that are rapidly breaking down inside. What we do is we take it out after 5 years in the reactor, and we put this set of metal rods, we put them in a swimming pool in the highly secure part of the plant next to the reactor, and it just sits there. If you look at it, it's got some blue glow coming off. That's the radiation coming out faster than the speed of light in water, so it gives this beautiful blue glow. That blue glow starts declining, and after about 5 years, you take it and you put it in canisters, and you wheel it out to next to the nuclear plant, and it just sits there. So, my question for people who argue that we have to do what the Finns have done and bury it underground is, how many lives are the Finns expecting to save? How many injuries are they expecting to avoid? Or was it just done for show so everybody can feel good? Now, if we're doing it for show so everyone can feel good, maybe we do it anyway. But if we can't demonstrate that there's ever been a history of anyone being hurt or injured, then we need to ask ourselves, is this the most efficient way to make people feel good? Now, I'm not telling the Finns to shut down their repository. I've been to their museum next to the repository. I've stood outside. I've caught a bus by their nuclear waste repository to get back to civilization. It's fine. But the Finns have a 93% approval rating for nuclear power. We have to ask ourselves this important question, Adam. Were they able to license and construct a nuclear waste facility because of the high approval rating? Or did they only get a high approval rating for nuclear because they built a facility to store the waste? I happen to believe that because they're not worried about the waste, they were able to license and construct and soon, and within a few months, start using the nuclear waste facility. I would argue that if you have that low level of fear, you're not actually improving things that much by making a mysterious hole in the ground that's worthy of making mysterious documentaries about. So, here's what I would propose to the Finns. Keep Onkalo repository, but don't put your own waste in it. It's not hurting anyone and you're not scared of it. It takes up almost no space. It's just sitting there. Instead, you should sell spots in your repository to waste from, say, from England, or waste from Germany, or waste from Italy, or any other country where there's some nuclear fear around waste. The Finns can make a lot more money, since they're not afraid of nuclear waste, selling like a nuclear waste hotel, right? Or an Airbnb for nuclear waste. They can open their mine for waste from other countries where they charge a bunch of money, so they make lots of money for the Finnish people, but they also allow other countries to not have to spend on making their own repository. The thing about the repositories is the waste, it's trapped in there if you put it deep enough. The question is whether you have to put it as deep as the ore that you first got the uranium out of. And if that satisfies people, well, there you go. Most of the uranium used in America, that's mined in America, or in the North American continent, comes from a mine in Canada, in Saskatchewan, that's exactly as far below the earth. And the uranium's been trapped in there for hundreds of millions of years. The uranium's down there at the same depth that over in Finland, they've buried down into the rock to put the waste. It's a little bit of a coincidence. I think it's not, but it's also an example of just saying rock has trapped uranium-bearing minerals for millions or hundreds of millions of years. It clearly can trap waste if we put it down there. I would just say the question is, do we need to? And is that what people are asking for it? I have a radical reinterpretation. And Adam, I should be clear. The nuclear industry does not say what I say. They disagree with what I say, but I think I can prove them wrong, and I think they've been ridiculous about this whole thing.
So what do they say then? What do the nuclear industry say?
They say we need to find a place to put it deep underground, and we need somebody to allow us to put it there, and we need some communities to step up and just take this stuff, and if they don't, we need somebody to force it as a solution, because our lawyers say we want the material off our books.
Got you.
That's what they say. Meanwhile, on the other side, you have people in the environmental movement from before when anybody cared about carbon, okay? who said if we can require storing nuclear waste underground, and then if we can block all storage sites, then we can shut down nuclear industry. But that's not the same thing as saying that nuclear waste itself is causing problems equal to what you're now causing if you don't have enough clean power and you can't decarbonize. But like I said, this strategy of requiring nuclear waste to go underground and then blocking the nuclear waste from going underground, therefore killing the nuclear plant, that strategy from the environmental movement precedes concern about climate being a top priority for that movement, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense, yeah. But in regards to the waste itself, you know, there is no denying that it is the most toxic material potentially in the universe. Well, not the universe, but yeah, let's just not the universe.
I would push back on that a little bit.
Yeah.
I would push that back on that a little bit.
Well, that's okay if you do, but let's just agree with it's one of the most toxic materials on Earth. Especially one that humans have created. It's not naturally occurring.
I would say, so biology is a little complex. There's a large number of things that if you consume it, you will die at much tinier doses of it than if you're consuming uranium, or depending on how long the particle you're eating has been out of a reactor, you're going to have different results. The further along it is, the better off you're going to be. I don't recommend eating any nuclear waste, let me just be clear, but if we were actually doing this, there's a reason why much more radioactive substances are used in small quantities injected into our bodies for nuclear medicine. Here I sit at my parents' house. My father was in oil and gas. My mother's career, nuclear medicine. What did she do? Tens of thousands of procedures where you inject highly radioactive substances in controlled quantities into the body in order to be able to see inside what the body is doing and to heal. Now, if you end up having a disease that can benefit from it, we sometimes put highly radioactive isotopes, ones so radioactive that they decay too fast to be there long-term in nuclear waste. We intentionally give that to people. We dose them with it in order to save their lives. So the famous bet here is between, say, plutonium, which is one of the components of nuclear waste. If you were offered an equal amount of plutonium or caffeine, which would you consume? It's a trick question. The lethal dose of caffeine is radically small compared to the lethal dose of plutonium.
Sure.
So my point there is, although I see where you're trying to get, but I would say that the reputation, the bark is probably a little worse than the bite.
Sure. But it's highly toxic. Whether you want to say it's the most toxic, the second most, it's a highly toxic substance that lasts for hundreds of thousands of years. So what is your...
Well, careful. If it lasts for hundreds of thousands of years, it's by definition not very radioactive. Because radioactivity means it's decaying, right? So almost all the health damages from the population around the Chernobyl nuclear plant were people who received a dosage of a radiotoxic, short-lived isotope that was gone within a month or two, right? So that was so toxic because it was so radioactive, but it meant it was so gone so rapidly. When people talk about the long-lived waste, it's by definition not particularly radioactive. So here's another way to approach it. But
still waste, yeah? So what the question I'm trying to formulate...
You could reuse it in a...
What we're going to do with it. My question is, Matt, what are we going to do with this stuff?
Well, okay, first of all, there's not much. Second of all, if you can reuse it, is it waste? The part that is dangerous for 500 years, that part is more the waste, but it lasts for about 500 years. The part that is radioactive for a much longer time tends to be the things that could be put back into a reactor to get more energy. Yeah. We don't currently have a reason to do that because nuclear fuel is really cheap. And the reprocessing itself leads us on to our second point about the connection between weapons and nuclear civilian energy. But just to say, if there's a very small amount of it, such that we can't even decide where to put it because there's no pressing physical problem. It's just a marketing and administrative problem, I would say, less than an engineering problem about where to put it. I say we should address this since it's not hurting people and people are worried about a couple 100,000 years. We should address it with the technologies that humans have always used to deal with questions of eternity. I mean, always have used. Like back to the pyramids of Egypt, humans have had to deal with the psychological issues of eternity, death, and the memory of the dead. So there have been anthropologists who have gotten involved in nuclear waste and said, oh, we need these memorial to say, don't come here. This is not a place of honor. Do not tread on this ground. Okay, well, then the other way to think of it is if the part that's really toxic is about a 300, 400, 500-year problem, because it's the short-lived,
Which
highly
is still a long
radioactive
time,
substances.
Mark. Hell of a long time still. When you think about human society 500 years ago to now, you know, to project 500 years into the future.
Adam, one of the things I loved about attending Cambridge is that I chose a college to be one of the oldest colleges, way older than 500 years, right? My high school in America was almost 230 years old, right? That's half the length of time we're talking about. The Catholic Church, love it or hate it, and I know the Brits separated from it, but the Catholic Church has continuous legal and physical presence all over the world, stretching back almost 2,000 years. Now, I'm not saying that it's the Catholic Church's job to deal with nuclear waste, only that for something that does not present a physical challenge, just say a legal or administrative challenge, I hear what you're saying, 500 years is a long time, but it's a manageable long time. There are pubs that old, all right? There are hotels in some countries under continuous family management that long. I'm saying we can deal with that as a human, considering it's not a very difficult physical pressing problem compared to, you know, the things that we're using nuclear to replace in the first place.
Sure. But if you consider, Mark, just say, for example, in the last 100 years, we've had two what's been considered world wars, you know, 500 years into the future to have a safe place for, you know, regardless of your argument of how toxic this stuff is, it's there. It will not decay to a respectable level for up to 400 or 500 years. That still needs to be put somewhere, you know, safe. And now you're saying that like Onkara isn't actually the best place, in your opinion, to put it. So where would you put?
Well, it's perfectly fine. It's in rural Finland. It's way out in nature. It's 400 feet underground, through about 120 meters underground of solid granite that's been a billion years old, of just the same granite there. It's perfectly fine. What I'm saying is it implies that it was necessary to protect people to do that. It was not.
Sure.
I don't know.
Yeah. But if we consider in 500 years, we could have another couple of world wars. It's a pretty good place in regards to longevity, long-term thinking about hazardous substances.
Can I put this back to you then? If
Yeah,
we
of course.
have world wars, what is a very small amount of slightly elevated radioactive metals in a can supposed to be compared to a global war? And in fact, if I wanted to get weird and if I can be controversial, am I allowed? If I can be controversial here on this podcast,
I think you already have been, mate. So you carry on.
let me push the controversy even further.
Yes, go for it.
You're talking about two world wars that somehow haven't happened since the development of what? Nuclear technology. Now, I'm not saying that the development of nuclear technology ended or is going to end world wars forever, but somehow it's a very peculiar coincidence, don't you think?
Well, it's certainly a mechanism. Obviously, mutually assured destruction as a policy has gone, you know, seems to have worked thus far. But, you know...
But we can't prove it has. We can't prove it hasn't. It's a perfect spiritual mystery. Yeah. When I said that I was intrigued by nuclear because of how deep it goes, here's one. Not only can nuclear people not agree whether it has or hasn't been effective, they can agree whether, if it has been effective, whether it's worth it. Or if it hasn't been effective, whether it won't be. Like, the level of disagreement on every part of nuclear is so deep and vast.
I agree with that.
We're not going to resolve it on the podcast for sure, but we're almost certainly never going to resolve it in reality.
Yes, that is my fear. Yeah, I don't think...
Doesn't mean we can't discuss it and introduce the problem to your
and of course as well. Exactly, that's what we're trying to do here. Introduce both arguments to the audience for them to take it where they will. So, okay, so in a nutshell, Matt, what you're saying is, and obviously I don't put words in your mouth, but for this particular topic of waste, it's not, in your opinion, it's not as toxic as people believe it to be. It's potentially up to 500 years.
The
we've
next
got
is
to
it's
sort
not,
of
there's
manage
not as
it
much
somewhere.
as people. So not as toxic as
There's not as much. There's not as much.
Not as much of it as we thought. And then 3, it's a very, very easy physical challenge to keep it protected from people. What is a very difficult thing is a spiritual or I don't want to say political because that's not deep enough. This is an actual spiritual issue. It's an issue of life and death and what our future
it's an existential issue.
So Adam, when you say what you're worried about, even 500 years being quite long, for how many things do you take a 500-year view? I happen to take it in architecture. I happen to take it in music. I love ancient music. I happen to take it in history. I'm obsessed with Egyptian archaeology. So I do take 500 years very seriously. I don't want to. I'm from a very new place. For settlement of white European Americans in Oklahoma is only about 120 years. Okay. However, I was obsessed with age and history, and I wanted to go to Cambridge, one of the most ancient environments for learning in the world. I wanted to go to one of the most ancient colleges. I wanted to live in the old courts of the old college because I'm obsessed with age and the change. So I don't want you for a second to think I'm not taking 500 years seriously. Instead, I take 500 years so seriously. I think we need rituals and some amount of celebration, considering the carbon-free energy we get out of nuclear, to help with both the memory that something occurred here, worth remembering, worth being careful about, but also, in my opinion, obviously mine, worth celebrating, which was the creation of clean energy that without a cost to the environment.
Yeah, okay, so let's move on to the next one then, Mark. So are the concerns about more nuclear power plants equals more proclivity to create more nuclear weapons valid?
The concern is valid, sometimes justified more than others. And here's another thing. The world is perfectly capable of and probably will spread nuclear weapons without any necessarily faster increase in nuclear energy. So there's a very depressing answer I wanted to get off front. Look, the common answer that people from the nuclear industry or nuclear advocates are going to tell you is, oh, there's no connection. Nuclear energy is like this. Nuclear weapons are like this. Well, I'll tell you, I managed to work at Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory, not directly on weapons, but more on anti-proliferation. We're working on detection to try to see if people were sending materials they shouldn't to places they shouldn't. So that's what I was working on that summer. But the topic of nuclear power and civilian nuclear energy never really came. I mean, it sort of came up, but it wasn't enough to catch anybody's attention. That's an example of how you can really have a separation between the military and security side and the energy, even within a facility specializing in one of the two. Here's what I will say, without a shadow of a doubt, is the connection. A competent scientific and engineering administration that can execute a nuclear energy program is probably going to be capable, should the desire and the cost, the amount of money be spent, to execute a weapons program. Now, I'll put it the other way around. You can execute a weapons program without any nuclear energy at all. Israel doesn't have any nuclear power. They've got the bomb. North Korea has no functional nuclear power plant. Okay? They use 100% coal electricity, or they just go without. But what they do have is a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
Then you have a weird example like South Africa, where the pursuit of weapons and the pursuit of energy happened, not exactly the same people, but an overlapping civil society, shall I say, military society. They got the weapon, they got the reactors, they gave up the weapon, they have the reactors. So I'm here to say, you phrase the question to say, if we get more nuclear, will it lead to more bombs? And I'm here to say, not necessarily, but I'm flipping it around on you. Not getting more nuclear energy is not at all an assured way to not have more bombs either. I'll tell you the U.S. point of view. The U.S. point of view for a long time was, we're going to set a good example. We're going to sell our really good nuclear technology around the world, and we're going to put lots of controls on so any country that works with America is going to be limited and not be able to make nuclear weapons. Well, two things went wrong. One, we stopped being good at delivering nuclear power plants to other nations. And then two, other people like Russia and China got very good at delivering nuclear plants to other nations. So if we Americans, as an example, I know you're not from America, and much of your audience may not be, but as we Americans, if we think we're going to influence countries by selling them nuclear and then tightly shackling, handcuffing them so they can't get any of the technologies that could be used for both. Because the civilian reactors that we sell, they're not very effective. I mean, I guess I can't say it would be impossible to make any amount of material if you had no supervision and you could just do anything you wanted. You could sort of pull off producing some but you don't have to have that stuff to do it, as identified earlier in my comment when I said that there were countries who didn't have that got nuclear weapons, right? However, if we were trying to constrain those countries and handcuff them, we've got to be able to deliver really well so that getting American technology in nuclear is more satisfying or more advantageous than just getting it from Russia or China, right? And we've got to keep up our moral leadership in spreading clean energy. If we're going to ban the fossil fuel investment, we've got to make sure that something that replicates the steady energy. And here's where you're going to have commentators say, no, I've seen studies that say that we don't need nuclear in order to do X. Let's put that aside. We're unlikely to resolve this on this show just to say that I disagree. So if America is going to be involved in nuclear trade, it's got to take a more active role in getting deals and signing up countries rather than retreating, because we are not the only player that will offer nuclear energy as a service. Now, I'm not saying that Russia is helping countries proliferate. Just they're landing deal after deal after deal after deal. Russia is building in Bangladesh, in India, in Iran, in China, in Russia. Russia's just built in Belarus. Russia just lost a brace of deals because they invaded Ukraine. Russia's building in Egypt. They're building in Turkey. So these are countries that, of their own free will, decided, their leadership, their power structure decided, we want nuclear. The Russians offer a good deal. Let's do it, right? So this is occurring. What we should ask ourselves is, if we're limiting ourselves in the West from being a part of the international nuclear market that seems to be booming anyway, are we doing it as an example or just a moral leadership position? And if not, I would like to see an equal amount of concern attempting to stop Russian nuclear deals if that's the level of concern, because we certainly in the West have really intense liability concerns for companies. They don't want to be involved in proliferating, and they take it very, very seriously. And that's built into our nuclear deals with other countries. So probably not exactly as clean an answer as you're looking for, just to say we live in a nuclear age. The nuclear age is upon us. It's very possible for a country like Germany to get rid of all their nuclear energy plants, even though they still have 20, 25, 30 gigawatts of fossil fuel capacity ready to roll any given day. They can get rid of their nuclear plants, and they still might decide as a nation to host nuclear weapons on their soil.
Yeah.
So in that I'm not saying there's no connection, just that what is the outcome? What's the aim you're going for if you strip out the nuclear energy and it's not at all clear that it stops the weapons? If I can give really quickly the steelman argument, which I've heard from some honest and well-meaning anti-nuclear campaigners, which is they say, quoting governments like in Australia or in the UK, they're quoting government ministers saying the nuclear defense program we're going forwards with needs a nuclear energy program to have shared value. Now, I didn't get the quote from the ministers correctly. I'm just pointing out that this is a correct way to look at the situation in some countries. Moving forward with nuclear energy is seen as compatible with continuing to have nuclear defense. Yeah. Typically, ministers are not talking about weapons. What they're usually talking about is reactors, military reactors that power, say, nuclear submarines. At that point, I'm not saying we open up a conversation on this podcast, what's the merits or demerits of having nuclear-powered submarines going around the world's oceans, just to say we do have them. And if we're attempting to stop the submarines by blocking the clean energy programs for on land, it might work in countries with weaker, smaller economies, like unfortunately Britain or Australia. I wouldn't call so much a weak economy, but it's unlikely that if we block America from building nuclear reactors on land, it will do anything to diminish our submarine fleet. Part of the claim might be that if submarine fleet recruits good sailors based on their ability to go work in nuclear plants afterwards, which is totally true. I've heard it stated that about half of American nuclear reactor operators come from the nuclear Navy, the Naval Nuclear Service.
Makes sense,
for the U.S. If that's something where you don't like the nuclear reactors on land, you may say that you don't want them to have this supply of sailors coming from the Navy, and you might not like the reactors on land because you say that it's connected to the Navy, which is these nuclear submarines going around with warheads. Which brings us back to those big, in my opinion, faith-based positions, which is, are we safer or less safe if, say, the USA or Britain or Australia scraps all plans to ever have a nuclear Navy again? Does that make us more safe or less safe? Views differ, right? I've heard political scientists, back at Cambridge, I heard a political scientist argue that if we succeeded in enforcing a ban on nuclear weapons around the whole world, where China and Russia both are voluntarily giving up their nuclear weapons because they see the West is, right? Let's say that's happening. This political scientist hypothesized, because you can't prove any of this, that it would make the world much more likely to engage in nuclear war, because it would mean that the first country to cheat and to rush towards bombs would be in a position like USA was in 1945, where who can oppose? Nobody has nuclear weapons except for one nation. They can unilaterally use it, and everyone else can go just cry in a corner. Yeah?
Sure.
So that was his hypothesis. I'm not saying it's true or false, just that it's not at all a consensus view that reducing the nuclear energy to try to indirectly hurt the nuclear military establishment would actually go forward to making the world a safer place. And specifically on the way you phrased your question, it's not at all clear that spreading nuclear civilian capability ipso facto means you're going to see more countries with nuclear weapons. I've happened to heard an argument, which I could buy. This is, again, all faith-based. We don't have a lot more than the evidence in front of us. That if countries get nuclear energy, they will be less nervous, more self-reliant, less scared, and they're going to be less likely to jump into a very expensive nuclear weapons program that diverts a lot of resources from traditional military and also from the economy. Is this true or not? I don't know. I just know we have examples of countries like South Africa who had nuclear weapons, gave them up, kept nuclear power.
Yeah. And theirs was obviously a political decision based upon a real sort of massive change in their almost like in their cultural psyche, going from apartheid to a brand new country with a lot of optimism. There was a lot of proactive sort of wanting to reconnect with the world and on a much nicer plane than they had been previously. So they potentially might be an anomaly. But when you look at countries, for example, like Iran, who there was this idea that if they get nuclear power, it's only one small step away from nuclear weapons. Now, are you saying that it isn't a small step as such? It's actually quite a big step from having a nuclear power plants in your country and then making the decision to go have nuclear weapons for even nefarious or political reasons. You're saying that's actually quite a giant step.
Let me address Iran. So Iran wanted a nuclear program under the Shah, and it eventually continued, and finally came to fruition over the last decade. Russians completed German and French projects in Iran. Okay? So that's what happened in Iran. What they also wanted was uranium enrichment technology to be self-reliant, to be able to fuel their own reactor. That uranium enrichment technology is identically usable to making weapons. So the world didn't really want them to have it, so they stole the technology from a European company. Now, that they have that, they say, our enrichment is so we can feed our power plant. Now, if they didn't have a power plant at all, that would be a much weaker excuse, like, our enrichment is so we can someday sell it to somebody. That is fundamentally dual-use technology. So the question we have to say is the world going to be filled with Irans, where they have a 40-year process of being international pariah states, having to steal technology, construct it? Is it better or worse that Iran has nuclear reactors that make civilian power or not? These are difficult questions. I would argue that if every country in the world got their own factory to enrich uranium, almost certainly each of those countries would start stockpiling the specific enrichment levels that they would need for weapons, or at least they would be prepared to have the shortest possible time. That's the so-called breakout time that's used to describe where Iran is. How long would it take if Iran decided to? Could they get the bomb? Now, what other countries are really close on breakout? Japan. Japan is extremely close at any given point to having a nuclear weapon. Is this good? Is it bad? Well, who's around Japan? China, Russia, North Korea. Is it good or bad? South Korea. South Korea has been controlled by America. We have stopped them from having enrichment. That Iran has. Iran has enrichment. South Korea doesn't. So they sit there on a peninsula where North Korea has nuclear weapons and declares, we will nuke you. Is it good? Is it bad? What I would ask is there a reduction of nuclear power that could occur to make North Korea not have nuclear weapons or to make Russia or China. No. The question is, going forward, is a control on the spread of nuclear energy going to be something that reduces the number of North Koreas, or is there something special about an Iran or a North Korea that makes it particular? And furthermore, why is it that you named Iran? I think that was correct to name as an example. But why don't you name Japan? Japan has recycling of nuclear waste. That's a dual-use technology. They have a bunch of tons of plutonium. That's really interesting.
I think it was because I consider Japan as a more stable part of the world right now than sort of where Iran is. So the reason I chose Iran is just because in that region, as we can see right now, it's very unstable. So that's why I picked it out more than say Japan.
Totally fine. And I meant it a little bit rhetorically. Almost nobody brings up Japan as an example of proliferation. Japan is friends. They make anime. They make good noodles. They're part of the Western economic order. So what I'm saying is, it cannot be proved one way or another. I mean, people can mess around with a tiny number of examples and say they've mathematically proven something. It cannot be proved that the spread of nuclear civilian technology will not in some way spread nuclear weapons technology. Those who say it can be proved, I don't agree. On the other hand, stopping the spread of nuclear energy technology absolutely cannot stop the spread, should it be occurring anyway, of nuclear weapons technology. Here's another thing. Although it is a spiritual or even a declared policy position of many organizations that we will get to a world with no nuclear weapons, not only do I think absolutely no 0% chance is that ever going to happen, I myself, as somebody who's now a new father of a 6-week-old baby, it's changed my life, as everyone said it would, makes me think about things a different way. I cannot tell you that I would feel safer in a world where all countries suddenly got rid of nuclear weapons. If anything, that makes a fairly dangerous and unstable world, and I'd rather take the devil I know than the one I don't. Here's another thing. We will not resolve any of those issues until somebody does something so direct as take a new civilian reactor that isn't good for bombs, and they make it into bombs and say, hey, look what we were able to do. We took this thing that we said was for peace and we made it for weapons. Here's another thing I don't think we'll be able to prove until there's another nuclear war. Inshallah, it will never happen. But if there's another nuclear war, then it will disprove that nuclear weapons have made large wars or nuclear attacks unlikely or impossible.
Sure. And these are,
and we will never prove it one way or another until those things occur. And even if those things occur, it wouldn't answer the question of whether more nuclear spread and therefore, say, prosperity wouldn't have helped. These questions end up being spiritual questions. Yeah. And they occasionally are really technical policy questions for the bean counters, counting each molecule of enriched uranium and checking to see whether the correct cost and military barriers are in the way for countries that want to spread the technology.
Got you. And like you say, you call it a spiritual question. It's an existential question. It's a philosophical question. It's a bloody interesting question.
And it's still technology. Adam,
of course
and it's still a bit technology.
Yeah. So, and obviously this podcast is... We're not going to answer these questions tonight between me and Mark. This is just information for the audience. So let's move on to the next one then, Mark.
Just one last thing, though. One last thing to summarize. Germans had major spiritual issues with nuclear power. So they constructed a massive fossil fuel pipeline to Russia, gave away control of their energy future, started ripping apart their own nuclear plants that they control, even though they don't have nuclear weapons and aren't trying to get one. And then they helped launch a war in Ukraine that they helped fund because of their fossil fuel addictions while claiming to be climate leaders and ripping apart their own nuclear plants that they controlled and were not using to proliferate. This is how weird and wrong it can go, and the answers are not simple on either side. I find a richer world based on civilian nuclear technology is likely to be one where we spread nuclear weapons perhaps slower, and we have more controlled international diplomacy and engagement. That's my position until it's proven otherwise. Yeah,
I get that. So now the last one, and now the last one is probably the most interesting in regards to environmentalists who are anti-nuclear, because they say everything that we've spoken about thus far is almost defunct because in their eyes, the time limit that we're on in regards to climate breakdown and the tipping points and whatnot, we're not going to have enough time to create this nuclear world where we would get the benefits of this zero carbon future. So what's your thoughts around that? Saying that there's just not enough time to make the world nuclear. All the resources and time that is needed can just simply go to renewables, which is done in faster times, gets the same, or around about the same benefits in their opinion. I'm assuming it won't be your opinion, but in their opinion. And it's all done in the time needed. So what's your thoughts on that, Mark?
First thing I would say, I appreciate this argument much more from people who are otherwise okay with or excited about nuclear energy, especially for mitigating climate change. So what I don't like is where people who have fought their whole lives to stop or slow down or impede building nuclear say actually what we meant is that slowness or that stopping, that's what we're really concerned about, not nuclear itself. Because I find that to be a very bad faith argument among those who don't. And here's the test, Adam. You ask those same people, oh, look, it looks like there's some major progress being made in China for building nuclear way cheaper than offshore wind. Are you for that now? And if they can't say, oh, that's fantastic, if only we could do it that cheap, should we figure out how they do it and see if we can learn from their techniques?
Yeah, I get it.
You get the point. So I get this on the nuclear side. I get the on the nuclear side where there's nuclear people who say wind and solar, they can't do it. They can't do anything. They could take more energy than they're worth. It's an accounting trick. It's fraud. And what I have to do is I have to ask them and say, okay, it's fine to be against wind and solar, but can you describe for me whether your arguments would be the same if we fixed this aspect, or if the cost went down to here, or we're able to do this? And if we are not, those of us on the nuclear advocate side, if we're not willing to stop and say, all right, my complaints about wind turbines were actually more that I don't like the sound they make, or I don't like the look at them. That's different than the technical arguments.
Yeah.
So if we're leveling the playing field as an argument and saying, if your chosen technology that you like turned out to permanently have a disadvantage, would you switch? There's one. Then the other one is, if the technology you don't like, be it nuclear for the people who are against nuclear, be it wind and solar for those against those, if those technologies turned out to be way better than you thought, according to the argument you just laid out that you're worried about the resources and the time, would you then turn around your argument, or is it deeper than that? Is it about the weapons? Is it about the waste? Because if that's true, it's the weapons and waste, we need to maybe route back that way. One of the things I'm doing professionally is figuring out how to deliver nuclear plants on time and on budget. It's a hard problem for those of us in the West. Heck, I'm a transit enthusiast. I don't own a car and I'm an American. Think of that. Transit is very important to me. How do we get transit policy right in cities? I sometimes feel it's a lot like that when trying to figure out how to do nuclear right. But that's only if we're looking at it as a actual economics question, not as a economics question posed, but actually deeper. It's a spiritual issue with nuclear power. For some people, it's an issue with having energy at all. If nuclear were fast and cheap, that would be against what they want because they want a world that doesn't use energy as much. Now, I'm for a world that if it is going to protect the environment and mitigate climate change, I think we need a lot of energy that is not destructive to the environment or making the problem we're trying to solve significantly worse. So that's my position. Here's the thing. It is actually the case that nuclear plants take an enormous amount of upfront time and investment, and until we figure out to do it as fast as the Chinese do with our same designs, we are going to continue to have to face that as a nuclear industry. We're going to have to face this complaint. The UK is an example of this. The UK has embarked on a nuclear project that took 7 or 8 years to propose and develop and finally say yes to. Then they chose the largest and most difficult reactors in the world to build. They're building it as a one-off project at the moment where if you finish your work on both reactors, you're done. You're gone. And the only way to not be gone is to be lucky enough to be rerouted on the side or just to go a little slower and more deliberately on your work. So it's difficult to get the spirit to get the job done effectively when there's not a follow-on job. That's just human nature, right?
Yeah.
So we have this situation where everything you described of taking time and energy and resources and people, all of this is occurring. Why on earth did the UK embark on it? And why is it effectively a bipartisan project? What does Tory and Labour continuing on the same project with the same mindset, what does that have to say to those critics who think that they know better than both sides? I'm not saying that mainstream politics are always right. here is what's probably happening. The upfront cost and investment has two aspects of it that I want to discuss. One is the thought that with that effort, you can get better at it afterwards. And two, there's a lot of hidden, brutal difficulty and traps in the alternatives to having stable, constant power. So people say, oh, the wind and solar, you build a bunch of storage. But the arguments for building renewable energy, it's not, if you're saying you're not harvesting a bunch of minerals and mining and doing a lot of construction industrialization, first of all, you are. That's required to build the infrastructure, the wind and solar. Second, you're needing to build the long transmission lines because you're putting the wind and solar out in nature. You're not putting it, if you're getting a ton of it, you need it out in vast areas, harvesting huge areas of very weak natural flows of weather, meaning you are going out, meaning you need to build the wires back in. Another thing is that if you're building an enormous amount of storage, like a bunch of mining and minerals and putting batteries together and siting them on the grid and dealing with fires, all the ups and downs of technology development, that's no longer just renewables. You need to compare to, say, having nuclear plus batteries, if you're going to compare it to renewables plus batteries. And you're really kind of comparing it to nuclear plus batteries without building extra transmission lines to the wind and solar plus the extra transmission lines and batteries. Then you have to say, what requires more batteries? Something where the output is flat as society's energy need is basically flat, or something where the output goes to zero to hero to zero to hero while society is pretty flat. So what you see is people saying nuclear is not worth the time and effort. Instead, let's not have an industrial sector. Or they don't say that. Some say it more directly, some don't. Now, you can argue we shouldn't use as much, so therefore we shouldn't have industry. Now we get back to some of that tricky situation we had in the previous answer. And none of this is clean, pat answers where there's some absolute thing and it's ended the debate and we just move on. It's more, these are the very important, difficult, actual trade-offs, actual decisions, actual unanticipated results that we have to face out in the world. If we don't have industrial production in Britain, does that mean the world doesn't need it and just moves on and Britain takes out its share and goes without? Or does it mean that Britain's just kind of poor, can consume less, but the world moves on without Britain? Is the world waiting on London? Is the world waiting on Manchester to decide whether to have industry or not? I don't want to push on too many painful things, but I find a very weird tension in left-wing politics in Britain, which I, noodled around with as a student. I was on a debate team with Jeremy Corbyn, for God's sake. As an American, I've done what I can to have the ability to comment on this situation, okay?
Go for it.
Let me just put it there. We won, by the way. We won, and you can find it on YouTube. I'll probably not be able to bring it up if I have a political career in America. But
okay.
my point is, there's an uncomfortable tension with the sticking up for the coal miners who lost their jobs at some of the most expensive and dangerous coal mines in the Western world. They were brutally shut down and they lost their jobs, but also saying we don't need industry and we don't want mining and we definitely don't want coal. How do we square those? Would a better outcome have been that people imagine that those coal miners would have been, every single one of them, a wind turbine tech or something? Or are we saying that they would have made a solar panel factory and worked at minimum wage? Like, what are we actually saying if we say we stick up for the workers who mine the earth for energy that causes pollution, but at the same time what we're saying is we don't want industry here, there, anywhere, so it doesn't matter if we don't have a stable, cheap, predictable, non-seasonal supply of power for it. I'm inclined to say that there's going to be industry, that it satisfies human needs much more efficiently, which is why people consume more, because it actually, a medieval Briton would have consumed about a quarter of the energy of a modern Brit. The modern Brit lives extremely richly and extremely well compared to the medieval Brit. What's the difference? The medieval Brit was scrabbling that last bit of tree. They were getting a little bit of crappy coal burned in a little brazier. These were ultra hyper inefficient uses of smaller amounts of dirty energy. What we've basically been moving towards, I don't want to be teleological and say, oh, it's always getting better. This is the Whiggish view of history on Green New Deal. No, there have been absolutely up and downs, but what we tend to find is extremely efficient satisfaction of needs in factories one of which the effect is to consume more. There are people that identify the level of consumption and say, what we do is we attack the ability to provide. And once we do that, the price will go up and the availability will go down, or something will happen to make us not have the effects of having industry in the first place. I would argue that nuclear has an interesting position where it can satisfy these needs with a tiny, very, very, very difficult to improve upon impact on the environment. Almost no mining, turned into almost no fuel, making vast amounts of controllable energy at very small locations so that you can send it exactly to the cities and the factories that need it for clean power, followed by that tiny, tiny amount of waste that it's up to us whether we celebrate the waste or not, because it won't hurt us either way. It's just sitting there in a container. And I think that I'm not going to be able to prove it on this podcast. We can live it and demonstrate it. There's going to be people who make outstanding arguments against. I would go with any of them to a nuclear plant to continue the argument.
Got you. Now, Mark, you've said there's so many things there, honestly, like we can delve into. We won't have time to go into them all, unfortunately, but just to pick up on a few things. So I totally get your starting position in regards to people making a bad faith argument. Yeah, you're saying that, but you're really talking about, you don't want it, so you're just using that as a shield. Yeah, when your real intentions are, well, actually, I don't want nuclear. I get that, but it's also a good faith argument. And I've spoken to people who have joined this sort of debate, so they're not saddled with sort of the CND baggage. They're not saddled with the Cold War baggage. They're coming into it fresh, yeah, from academic perspectives, much like yourself, very technical perspectives, much like yourself. And when they say it's about time and resources, they've also added in the factor that you've already brought up, which is the political factor and how long these things take. Not in a material sense. I mean, if you wanted tomorrow, the government could say, right, I want 100,000 engineers, is £10 billion, go and make, 20 reactors in the UK, right?
Right.
And within 10 years, boom, we might be rocking, yeah? But they factored in the reality of the politics in places like Britain. Yeah, they factor this into their thinking. It's not just a material way of thinking. It's not just about skills and engineering. It's not about the workers. It's about the reality that's faced us. And what they're saying is, Mark, all things sort of considered, yeah, the time it would take in this political reality for the vast, in fact, even if you said like Western Europe, which are the highest polluters, in North America, if they were just the highest polluters, just if those guys became nuclear, it would have a massive impact on the environment, because obviously the global north emits so much more than the global south in regards to pollutants. But it's just factoring all that in, Mark, and then coming up with a proposal that it just isn't going to happen in the time needed. And that is why they've gone down let's focus on something that potentially we can get across the line in the time.
Let me just steelman this. You're saying that people have looked at all things and said, we know nuclear won't deliver, or we strongly suspect nuclear cannot or should not deliver, but we should do another path.
No. They're looking at it and saying, regardless of whether nuclear can deliver or not, yeah, in the time it would take in the political reality that we live in, which is where in Britain a nuclear power plant will take 10 years to get off the ground, let alone be made. Yeah, it's the factoring.
So
those
that
sorts
time has
of,
already been put in the case of the next plant. In other words, that 10 years has been served, shall we say? It's just a decision of whether to go forward. But I understand what you're saying. It's just that time, that 10-year lead up, has been invested at several different sites with enough potential to make 50% of your electricity or so. So like I would say normally if you're starting from scratch, but Britain has a bunch of sites with transmission already. What I would probably say is that a lot of people making these arguments are very weakly informed about the difficulty of the alternatives. They think that because we built wind turbines quickly onshore, or because we've put the windiest spots with Scotland, filled them up with wind turbines, that it's just a matter of next stepping that. That's what I have difficulties on. This week alone, we've seen one of the world's 3 leading wind companies cancel much of their offshore wind projects in Europe for countries that intended those exact projects to be the alternative to nuclear. Now, if that happens, we know nuclear can power a whole country. We've proven it. It's demonstrated every day. We do not have the proof. We do not have the demonstration for the alternative. It might occur. It might not. There are engineering arguments against. There are technological optimism and modeling arguments and political arguments that we can.
And trajectory arguments.
I would say that we are comparing a pathway we know physically can deliver. We don't know if politically we can do it, to a pathway where both the politics and the engineering are not at all certain. In the United States, we had a disastrous time building 2 new state-of-the-art reactors in Georgia. Catastrophic over budget.
Yes.
And those reactors are going to produce power much more cheaply and much more valuable power than offshore wind that's expected up front to cost the same amount. You get my point, where people don't actually compare the power to power from the offshore wind that's required to do the scale of decarbonization we're talking about, where there isn't the same option for onshore wind or onshore solar.
Yeah. What was the estimated cost in regards to the reality of the cost in Georgia? Because that came up recently, but I forget the figures.
It's about 34 billion USD was the total cost, of which the ratepayers were responsible for about the amount they agreed to up front. So decent there. It just meant that a lot of corporations lost a bunch of money on the project, and they're not willing to do the same project the same way without better guarantees. For the ratepayers themselves, they appear to be putting in very approximately about $80 a megawatt hour is what the public is going to be paying for those reactors. What the public is supposed to be paying for the offshore wind in New England is anywhere from $110 to $160 a megawatt hour, but they have to pay a lot more for the backup power plants to deal with. And why is this? If offshore wind is cheaper in Britain, why is it? Because it's nature-based energy, and building that in a high wind, high current, deep ocean environment like the offshore of New England, it's not the same thing as the North Sea. So be careful thinking that there's a simple way to say, well, nuclear is this, but offshore wind is this. In the end, love it or hate it, offshore wind is very much in nature and a part of nature and at mercy with nature. If you see costs when you have it down here, it's not going to be necessarily the same to have costs when you have it a different way. We're finding that out with the first major offshore wind projects in the US. Why am I comparing those two things? Because if we're not just doing a simple degrowth, we don't need energy at all argument, which people make, and that's a different question than the one I think we're asking here, which is how does nuclear energy compare to getting that energy from a different source, right? Or a different program. Yeah. What we're seeing also is that offshore wind would need to be accompanied by power plants that are ready in case we don't have power during a high demand period. That is kit sold separately, shall we say. The thought was that you could connect to Quebec Hydro and balance the Quebec Hydro with the offshore wind. As it is, Quebec has this issue. One, they have some droughts. So that can mean they run out of hydro on a sort of not a continent scale, but a very big area.
Yeah, massive
Second,
scale,
they oversold to different parties how much hydro they would have. And they've started only making contracts for their hydro if they don't need it in that moment, which means you still need the backup to know that you have. So this is where people say, oh, we'll do the hydrogen. Great. So there's a lot of people in the environmental movement with very big skepticism on hydrogen because they see it as a big give out to the existing fossil fuel industry, which it effectively would be. So you're not free of moral arguments there. It comes back to taking a very realistic view of if we say we're doing it all without nuclear. What does that actually entail? There was a recent scandal that broke out on Twitter this week, Adam. So this is what? The end of last week of August, where there was a scholar, a climate change scholar. She's not an engineer. She's about words and arguments, right? She had been endorsing 100% renewable studies. At the same time, she was viciously attacking anyone who was for carbon removal. What she hadn't checked is whether the 100% removal studies rely on immense amount of carbon removal, which almost all of them do. So you had this weird situation where the words were one way, the vibes were one way from non-technical commentators on the issue, but they weren't even reading their own scientific papers that they were saying was their pathway, and they were fighting the very things needed to get there without nuclear. So, great caution needed. The trade-offs are much more vicious than most people assume. the most interesting argument for me in the world on this issue, by the way, one where I waver on what I think, is Australia. Australia is immense. It is sunny. It has it's a very stable continent with very stable weather, right? They don't have a civilian nuclear industry. They have a bit of a research reactor industry, and they claim they're going to get nuclear subs. But they don't, as of yet, have the nuclear power industry. And they have an immense amount of renewables already developed and under development. Question there is there a role for nuclear in Australia? Now, that's an interesting question. It's not as interesting a question in Britain, which has long, cold, dark winters. Mm-hmm. That puts a very harsh difficulty on solar, which is typically the more predictable of the renewables. The wind is abundant if it comes. If it doesn't, you don't have it. Trouble with the grid is making up for that delay. It either means making it where society just doesn't have energy, or having such an immense and all-consuming investment in the storage that you make up for, say, all your supposed advantage, both politically, materials, difficulty, all that stuff. You make up for that in needing storage, but you don't tell people that until you're deep down, and it's now 10 years, the 10 years lead time that you said you needed, and you could then have nuclear from then till the end of time. Britain's the only country in the world that doubled down in the 70s on everything being into reactors that don't have unlimited lifespans. And by unlimited, I mean 60, 70, long after we're dead. Sizewell B is your only reactor in Britain of a modern design that can be refurbished and can be continually maintained and upgraded, okay? That Sizewell B reactor, that is going to keep trucking and trucking and trucking. But if you went back in time and looked at the economics, you wouldn't be able to say what you're saying in 2025, where in 2025, it's as good as new. In 2040, it will also be as good as new. In 2060, so it doesn't mean you're wrong in the lead up time, and we still can't build nuclear quickly in the West. I'm working on it. We're not there yet. But what happens is we get to 10 years on, and something very weird happens. Once it's there, we keep having it, and we keep still having all the same arguments about the future. I want to leave you on this question answer with Nick Clegg. Nick Clegg, everybody's favorite Facebook senior vice president, or whatever he is. Nick Clegg shot a video. He's a very smart guy, like McKinsey smart, right?
The Lib Dem. Nick Clegg.
The Lib Dem guy. Yeah, the last Lib Dem in power in the government. So Nick Clegg,
I wouldn't say he's not necessarily respectable. Let's see what Nick Clegg's got to say. You go on, man.
I know. I'm sorry. Look, Brits don't understand that. I have dry humor like you guys do. I sound like an American, but I've been told I have good chat.
I wasn't sure if he had better.
Adam, my Twitter handle is Energy Bants. My Twitter handle is Energy Bants, and I have to explain that to every single American who asks for it. They say, "What's a Bants? What's a BANTS? What's that?" And I'm like, "Banter," and they're like, "Banter? You mean like talking?" And I say, don't bother with it. This isn't a joke for you. So
let's see what Nick Clegg's got to say. Yeah,
had a video in 2000, I think it was 2011, 2022, and he said even if we started nuclear today, it wouldn't be ready until 2021. Do you know what happened in 2021, Adam? The worst energy disaster to hit the Western world since the oil embargo. It would have been very nice back when he shot that damn video to have nuclear making up for the natural gas that Russia cut off from Germany, right? But from his mind, where there's an election coming up now this goes to the point you made about the politics, the difficulty of sticking to a long-term plan. I get it. The political economy, to get nerdy, is very difficult for nuclear in a lot of places. But if Nick Clegg's timeline, where we would only have the power in the future, and then the future arrived, you didn't have the power, but you did have a massive, catastrophic, damaging energy crisis, well, it makes you think. That's what I said. I'm obsessed with long time periods. I'm obsessed with doing things right that echo in eternity. I want to do things right that don't leave us with a climate crisis. I want to do things right that leaves us with enough for our grandchildren's grandchildren to have a beautiful existence. In my opinion, having looked at it numerically as well as spiritually, I've decided that nuclear energy is the path that we can achieve that. And I understand why people disagree, but as long as they're interested in a spirited debate like the one we've sort of had by proxy here, I'm game for it.
Yeah. What I would say is a big problem with the UK is we don't seem to be going down either the renewable or the nuclear path. We're sort of stuck in a stagnant space where...
You're doing both. Can I push back a little? You're doing both.
Well, not on a scale that's filling me with confidence in regards to climate change. It's just nudges, tweaks, and discussions, and then, counter discussions, and then it gets bogged up in legislation, and then something like is nudged a little bit. It seems very much along those lines. And again, tonight, unfortunately, we're not going to come to the conclusion of which of those pathways we should be going down. However, Nick, Mark, I do want to end on this. So we're coming to the end of the show now, and it's been fascinating. And you know what, as well, we could talk for another 3-4 hours, mate, honestly, about it. But could you sum up...
Preferably in a 500-year-old pub with nuclear waste buried under it.
Yeah. Could you sum up for us, Mark, in a nutshell, the reason why you believe, in a pro-nuclear atomic future?
Nuclear energy provides an immense amount of energy with almost no carbon emissions, almost no environmental footprint, but with lots of stable, long-lived, multi-generational jobs. And it provides it in a way that's conducive to every other goal people might have for society being possible based on the output of the power plant. Nuclear energy is very powerful and very stable, and in the end, that's what you need to solve large, hard, society-scale problems, of which climate change happens to be a pressing one.
Brilliant, Mark. Thank you so much for your time, mate. Really appreciate it. And I'm going to follow your work, and anything you want to link us up with to educate our audience further, please do. Thank you so much, mate. Okay, this is the part of the show that's dedicated to the fighters, the healers, and the conservers of the world that are doing their bit for all of us. It's the shout out. Mark, who have you got for us this week, mate?
I've got for you the president of the EU Commission, Ursula von de Leyen. Despite being German and Germany being famously anti-nuclear, yesterday, Adam, she said at a conference in Prague that the EU needed, quote, more nuclear. She said they need more energy independence, so she said more nuclear, more renewables, more efficiency. But the fact that a German president of the EU Commission said publicly we need more nuclear is astonishing, and it probably came at some risk to her and her domestic position. So I want to just give that shout out to a brave lady for changing her tune on nuclear from only a few short years ago. I do believe that EU is going to be ready to be a climate leader if they have independence of energy along with clean energy, and Ursula's shouting out of nuclear was a definite thing that needs our support.
Fair enough. Well, thanks for that, mate. And a big thank you to everyone that is listening. And remember, if you're helping the planet in any way at all, no matter how big or small, we love you, we appreciate you, and I hope you'll join us again next time. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you liked it or enjoyed it, please leave a review or a comment on iTunes and Spotify and tell your friends. Or if you really like the show, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/GND Media UK. And here's a special shout out to all our top tier patrons, including Quilty O'Connor, Guillermund, Harriet Williams, Jill Burke, Karen Taylor, Kaylee Woods Harley, Lizzie, Marie Louise O'Hanrahan, Steve Smith, and Joe Lindstone.